Working in a community disaster situation that's prolonged, we will find that there's going to be issues with people saying, I didn't know I'd have to do this, or what do you mean I get to work at the school doing triage? And every hospital looks at ways to prevent impacting their emergency and critical care areas during time of sustained and prolonged disaster. So we are happy to have people here to discuss the process. I want to just quickly introduce foundation members. Cindy Rosen is down there. You can't see her. She signed you in, the woman in the nice outfit. We have Dave Clausen, who you probably can't see either, but he's at the table. Stu Tannenberg, our treasurer. And I don't know. Oh, there he is, Tom Cromwell right behind me, the vice president. And I'll be introducing our panel shortly, but we hope this will serve as, it will never be a training that you can say, oh, I'm trained now, but we're a work in progress. And our guest speaker, who will give more information on later, Dr. Jan Horn, is sitting over there. So not to delay, we have first Dr. Lisa Santora, Deputy Public Health Director, and we have Ryan Rodriguez, who's with Marin General and Safety, and he's the liaison and, I don't want to say coordinator of disasters because we don't want that, but disaster planning person. And then Dr. Tom Cromwell, who's with MMRC and has served in the community in leadership positions for some time. So I'm going to turn it over to them, and I think everybody has an outline of today, and we'll have some time for question and answers as we end the 10-minute presentation. Thank you.
There's very specific capabilities that the county is now responsible for maintaining, and one of them is, Ryan Rodriguez, who will speak right after me, is the Healthcare Preparedness Program, or HPP. So as part of our grant funding, we have HPP, which is to basically prepare our community health system of care for a disaster and for potential surges. And so we meet on a regular basis and develop work plans and trainings. We have a training upcoming in the spring, May 25th. So it's a drill that we're hosting with the hospitals. The MMRC will be participating as evaluators, and then to determine what's the capacity that MMRC can be deployed. And we were talking a little bit earlier, just to probably explain what's the relationship between the county and the hospitals and the MMRC. And this past winter, I got a phone call, a kind of an urgent phone call from an emergency room physician here at Marin General Hospital saying we're having too many patients coming to the emergency room. What are we going to do? And what was happening is we are aging in Marin County, and we have a lot more people living in different assisted living facilities as well as skilled nursing facilities. And we got a phone call to our health officer, which is where we both started having a conversation about what can we do to help support the hospitals prevent this surge. What was happening is we have had a significant flu season in our community, and we are experienced that people who are in assisted living facilities were coming to the emergency rooms for symptoms that didn't need necessarily a physician visit and didn't necessarily need an ER visit or a hospitalization, but they needed some triaging and attention. And our first thought that came to our mind in a way to potentially buffer the emergency rooms was deploying the Medical Reserve Corps. We have nurses who have the ability to go to assisted living facilities who could then report back if someone really does need to go to the emergency room, and that would be one very simple, elegant solution to trying to decrease that surge. So we work very closely with the hospitals, we work very closely with the skilled nursing facilities in order to maintain the capacity. Again, we are always preparing for a larger disaster, but as you can see, a flu itself can sometimes create that surge that we need to be able to meet the needs of. And even in flu season, you have the regular accidents, especially during flu season, when it's rainy, when it's wintry, when the floods are here, you're having a lot more impact into our emergency room. So do we learn as a system of care to make sure that we are providing the essential services, that we're meeting the needs of our residents in the community, and that we are also then activating our system. So as part of the county, we have these conversations that would have been a kind of a quick fix. It would have been a phone call, potentially calling up to our medical health operational area coordinator, also known as the Mohawk, who is Miles Julin, located in emergency medical services. if you can imagine, some of probably could have had a better information that this was happening with communications just from EMS itself. So EMS is your emergency medical services. They work with all of your ambulances in the community, and we heard the same story from Miles when we checked in with him at that point, that they were surging in those ambulance routes and visits to the emergency rooms in our community. And so your Mohawk, that area coordinator, then works with us to see, do we need additional resources? Are the resources that we have in this county, and Ryan will probably speak to this, they have memorandums of understanding or MOUs with different hospitals and different resources if they need surge resources. And they have to go there first. So they try and take care of any surge needs that they have first within the hospital and with their relationships and structural relationships that they have. But then the next step is, when does this get too big and when do they need to call in to the county? And that's the Mohawk relationship. And one of the primary assets or resources that the Mohawk would have is the Medical Reserve Corps. Like you saw, just with Matt and I just discussing what could we do to buffer those emergency rooms, it would be deploying nurses to an assisted living facility. So it's something that we're still learning. Yesterday I was just working on our grant. We submit a grant every single year where we look at capabilities, and a lot of times it's just, we have a lot of plans, but they can get very dusty on the shelves, and you can have change in staff, and how do we make these living, breathing plans so when it does happen that we need to activate our system, that we're ready to activate. Unfortunately, we had a pretty rough winter season, and the silver lining to the flood season is that we did activate our EOC very frequently this season, and it prepared a lot of us. So even the process of getting called out and calling your staff who are assigned to your emergency operating center, which is at 1600 Los Gamos, is something that has to be drilled and has to be tested. And so the silver lining of a tough season was that we are much more tested than we've ever been. And we've been able to have some after-action reports and improvement plans in order to build our capacity.
Good morning, everyone. How's everyone doing this morning? Thank you for being here. As the representative of the host venue here, Marin General, we welcome you. So very happy to see everyone. So I'm Ryan Rodriguez, the Manager of Safety and Patient Mobilization. I'm the co-chair the chair of the Emergency Management Subcommittee. So just talk a little bit about our structure. We do have an emergency management subcommittee, or disaster preparedness committee, and it's multidisciplinary. We get great participation, and we coordinate our drills, and we talk about current events, and we look at how we work with entities like the county and the MMRC. And we are, our emergency management is actually regulated as part of our accreditation process through the Joint Commission and now CMS. So there are very stringent guidelines and standards that we have to meet for emergency preparedness. There are 6 critical areas that we're required to meet. There's clinical staffing, communications, utilities, resources, and assets. And I'm probably forgetting another one. I know that was 5. And it'll probably come to me, pop up. And so we organize our program in that way. And right now we're in the process of planning our full-scale exercise for May 25th, which is a mass casualty incident. So we're using a program called 15 to 50. It's 15 to 50. It's a program to prepare to receive 50 patients in 15 minutes. So it's a program a lot of hospitals are starting to do, and so that's what we're gonna try to test. And so we've got a lot of folks that are planning for that, and it's going pretty well, I think, so far. And we'll obviously, when we do these kinds of tests and drills, we're looking at a lot of holes and gaps in our program and our response. So that's always a great learning opportunity for us when we do these drills. So, Lisa talked a little bit about a surge. What happens when we get a lot of patients on our doorstep. It could be for a number of reasons, but structurally, as we talked about, we are required to have an all hazards plan. And so we have something called our Emergency Operations Plan, or our EOP. And we like to use a lot of acronyms. in this kind of area. So there's a government, with FEMA, it has their whole set of acronyms and language, and the county kind of, I think, takes from the government speak, and then the hospital on the healthcare side, we have our own sort of speak, our own language. So it is kind of a challenge to sort of bridge those two worlds and to translate those things, because sometimes FEMA doesn't care what the Joint Commission is requiring, and that now with CMS, with their new regulation, that which is the Center for Medicaid Services, they've aligned with the Joint Commission, which is what we align to for our accreditation. And so we have our emergency operations plan, and that is an all hazards plan. So whether it's an earthquake or a utility failure, we need to be prepared for all eventualities. One of the things that, in addition to that we are mandated to have is something called a Hazard Vulnerability Assessment, or our HVA. And that is where our Disaster Preparedness Committee takes a look at all of our hazards and what are our top risks in the organization, and we rank those risks, and we come up with our analysis there. And so then we can drill for those eventualities, those that we've determined are our highest risks. We can then look at how do we address those risks then. And so, patient influx is one of those. I think it is definitely not one of our highest risks, but it gets an eventuality it could be for an earthquake, it could be for pandemic flu, it could be for a number of different things. So it is something that we wanted to test. The incident on May 25th will be a smart train collision with a bus. So the school bus. So we do have a smart train that's coming in from North Bay to here to San Rafael. I think it's going to be starting at the end of this year, and they're doing tests now. So that's the scenario we chose to drill to get a lot of patients on our doorstep. So so the hazard vulnerability assessment is also done in collaboration with the county. So the county has their own assessment, as do other hospitals. And so what we're working on now is aligning all those hazard vulnerability assessments together, so that we all know what each other's top risks are in the organization, and we can sort of align our planning accordingly. So I think that's working really well. Our collaboration with the county has been really strong, and there's always more opportunity for improvement. We learn things every day. So when we respond to a disaster, we can rely on our planning and our drills, and the HVA certainly helps with that. One example I'll give that's a top vulnerability for us right now is, as you've seen around our campus, we're doing a lot of construction. So MGH 2.0 is what we're calling our new hospital. It's going to open in 2020. We're very proud and excited for that new hospital, but along with that comes a lot of risk for construction incidents, utility failures. And so we've already had a lot of incidents around our utilities, mostly in preparation for utility outages. So they had to shut something down to do some work. So we've done a lot of preparation and drilling on our utilities, and that's sort of one of our highest risks right now. But in addition to the earthquakes and as well, it's always certainly a big concern. So we work really closely with the county on all of those. And in an event of a disaster, and the triggers are, if we were to experience any gap in service, if our ability to maintain operations was compromised, we would activate something that's called code triage, which means that we would go into our disaster mode. We would open up our incident command center. And we have two different levels for that. We have a full-scale activation, but before we get there, we have a lower level activation where we can kind of open up a situation room, have a small number of command staff, and then we can build out from there. And that's the great thing about using something called the Hospital Incident Command System, or what we call HICS. It was based off of the ICS system. ICS is the Incident Command System that the emergency preparedness, emergency services folks use out in the field. And so hospitals have now adopted the Hicks framework. So if I'm kind of speaking very in basic terms, but it's good that everyone understands sort of the basic structurally of how the hospital operates. So we activate our hospital incident command system, and that could start with a very small command staff, incident commander, a few other positions. And then what's great about Hicks is that it's modular. You know, you can build out what you need from there, based on what the disaster is, and so it's scalable. Should we need to open up our full-scale command center, we do have that command center located in our Larkspur room across from our Green Bay Grill cafeteria there. And we activate the positions that we need, and our communications are set up there. We have our forms, and we sort of go into action from there. And in communication with the ER and other areas throughout the hospital, we can send runners, we activate a labor pool, and so we get the incident moving from there, and we take control of the hospital grounds, with security and access control being a big piece of that. And we work with something called our administrative nursing supervisor, who's in charge. It's the nurse that's in charge of the whole hospital during operations, and so they would most likely start off as the incident commander. And so these are things that we train to with all of our staff on our incident management team. So we do Hicks training, and we're going to be training our executive team, because they're also our executive team, our C-suite, can also be designated as administrators on call. So they have a rotating schedule of executive being sort of on call in the event of any things that are, disruptions to service. So we're going to be doing a lot of training with the executives coming up to run a disaster. What does that mean to be an incident commander, and to kind of hone their skills a little bit more in the event of a disaster. So when that's rolling, what we could do in regards to the county is we could do something called issue a resource request. So that is a request to, in this case, the MOOC, which was the Medical Health Operational Area Coordinator. Can't believe I got that right. And so we would issue a resource request saying, hey, we need help, we need staff or resources, whatever it is, and Miles and the county would work on providing those resources. So I think that would come from out of our command center. So that's something we've tested before. Works really well. We are in very close contact with the county on a lot of different issues, even with construction incidents and the pandemic flu. Coordinate very closely.
First of all, I'd like to thank Linda Ray for organizing this entire thing. This has been a rather significant effort, as she will tell you, and she, I think, has done an extraordinary job. What we're trying to do is build a stronger relationship between MMRC operations, MMRC Foundation, Marin General Hospital, and the County of Marin. So that's our overriding goal, and it's taken us some time. We are getting there. We have a ways to go, and she wanted me to talk about MMRC and volunteer opportunities for those of you on the faculty here at Marin General Hospital, of which there are many, and I'll get into that in just a minute. First obvious question, I think, for us is, why do we need a Marin Medical Reserve Corps? After all, we have 3 major hospitals in Marin County, Marin General, which with its very capable emergency room. We have obviously Kaiser, and we have Novato. All 3 are first-class hospitals. All 3 do a very good job. So the question is, why do we need a Medical Reserve Corps? We also have an extremely competent group of first responders in Marin County. I sit on the Southern Marin Paramedic Advisory Council. We review their data every few months, and I can tell you they are well above national standards and do a remarkable job. So again, why do we need a Medical Reserve Corps? The reason is that all of those riches that we have, including medical capability and first responder capability, are going to be quickly overwhelmed if we have a region-wide disaster. Do we have a chance of having a disaster? Most of us tend to I think, get a little insular and think we live in Marin County. Disasters don't occur here. We think about hot tubs and peacock feathers and things of that sort. But do we really have a threat of a disaster? And let me remind you, let me go through a couple very quickly, and I'm going to stay very local. Jan Horn will get a bit more global in a few minutes. The things that we are exposed to are fires, floods, and earthquakes. What about fires? Anybody here in 1991? Have we had a significant fire in the Bay Area? Yes, we have. It's the Oakland firestorm. It was in 1991, and it still is the worst fire in the history of this entire country from the standpoint of property loss. 2,000 homes burned down, 25 people died. You want one a little more recent? A year and a half ago, 2015, the Valley Fire up near Clear Lake, which burned 75,000 acres of uncontrolled firestorm. MMRC sent a team up there for an entire week providing medical care because there was none available. You want a fire a little closer to home? Angel Island, a half a mile off the shore of Tiburon, half of it burned in 2008 in 12 hours. No homes burned, no people died because there weren't any out there. But what if that would have happened in Belvedere? What if it would have happened in Mill Valley? So you kind of get an idea that, yes, we do face some disasters. How about floods? We haven't thought much about floods for the past 6 years because we've had a drought. If you were here in 1982, things were a bit different. This has been a year of extraordinary rains. Fortunately, the rains did not come all at once. In 1982, they did come all at once. And we had major flooding throughout the entire county of Marin. If you went through Corte Madera Larkspur at that time, water was clear up to the windshields of cars. We had a house slide down across Paradise Drive in the Tiburon Peninsula. We had major flooding on the Belvedere Lagoon. So we had major problems at that time. How about earthquakes? We are known worldwide as the epicenter of earthquakes, and it's for a good reason. We live in one of the most seismically active areas of this entire world, and we're well known for that. We have the San Andreas Fault, a little bit off the coast to the west of us. Worse than that, we have in the East Bay 7 additional faults, 4 of which are more active and more dangerous than the San Andreas Fault. So sometime we are going to have a problem. People who study this sort of stuff say it's not a matter of if, it's simply a matter of when and how close and how big. But we will have an earthquake in Marin County at some time in the future. So roll the dice. When's it going to be? So what do we do in response to those sorts of threats, which most of us don't even want to think about, but some of us, obviously those of you who are here, do. And what we have to do is get ready. And we're doing our best to get ready on the Belvedere Tiburon Peninsula and actually throughout the entire county. Let me give you a hypothetical. The Belvedere Tiburon Peninsula has 12,000 residents. We have 2 roads out of Belvedere and Tiburon. One of them, Paradise Drive, went down in 1982. We could not use it for 5 or 6 months. We have 5 firefighters, a maximum at any one time of only 5 firefighters, and we have 1 ambulance. Now let's add to that mix. Tonight we go home, we have a little rumbling in our house, and we have an earthquake, and it's a 7.5 earthquake. And this is not fantasy. This is a very real possibility. So we still have the same issue on the Belvedere Tiburon Peninsula. We have 12,000 residents. We have 2 roads out of here, or out of Belvedere Tiburon. 1 is now down because of the earthquake. We have 5 firefighters, and that's all, and they're now tied up with a half a dozen fires that have occurred because of the earthquake and ruptured gas lines, and they have no mutual aid, which is the way they handle an overload now, because all of the other fire services are now tied up in their own communities. So I think you start to see that we may have some problems. We calculate on Belvedere Tiburon Peninsula that if we have a 7.5 earthquake, we are going to have 87 major injuries. How are we going to deal with those? 7.5 is a fairly serious earthquake. It's not the strongest one, as you probably have heard. 9.2 is the strongest one on record, I believe, so far. Came out of Alaska some years ago. But Loma Prieta, which occurred in our backyard, was a 7.1, and it took down part of the Bay Bridge. The Haitian earthquake was a 7.0 and killed 300,000 people. I happened to be there with, I guess, what you could call an enhanced Medical Reserve Corps, it's a federal disaster medical response team, and I can tell you, if you're up close and personal to something like that, you become a believer very, very quickly. The destructive force is phenomenal. So we're going to get ready, and what we have done on the Belvedere Tiburon Peninsula is spent the last 25 years trying to get ready, and that involves a whole host of things that we have done. One of them is to have a first aid station, which we have developed at Del Mar School, which it's a secondary school. Why Del Mar? Because it's centrally located, and because it's the strongest building on the peninsula, because it had to be built by state standards for schools. So it's the last building, we think, that's going to suffer major damage. We have $30,000 worth of medical equipment stored there, and I have a promise from 50 physicians and nurses that they will show up in the event something happens. Now, they're all not going to be there, but some will, and if we have 10 of them, we're in pretty good shape, actually. They all come from California Pacific Med Center. That's because that's where my practice was for 45 years, and I simply called people and said, will you respond to us if we need you? And the response was 100% yes. That's the kind of thing that the rest of the county needs to develop. That has not happened yet. We're trying to get them to do that. So where does the Marin Medical Reserve Corps fit into all of this? There are several things that we are capable of doing, although we could, with your help and your active medical staff, do a lot more things. One of those is to assist your hospital in the event of a disaster, set up in your parking lot, although we can also deploy to a field and set up in tents if we have to. We can deploy to other places in Marin. We can deploy out of Marin, which we did to the Valley Fire a year and a half ago. We did basically clinic work, set up in a library there, and did, I think, a very good job. We can serve the underserved through our health hubs, which we are doing at Marin City and the Canal District. We can provide mass inoculations, which you just heard about. We have also participated in that. And we can educate the community. When we're not doing these other things, and we're obviously not going to have a disaster frequently, we can educate the community as we go along. And our major program for education now is called FADER, First Aid for Disaster Response. It is basically Stop the Bleed, that is a national program that has been developed by the American College of Surgeons and the American Medical Association and virtually every other subspecialty in medicine. It's aimed at training non-medically trained people how to get involved when needed to stop the bleed. It derived from Boston, and it has been reinforced many, many times with the plethora of high-velocity weapon attacks that we have seen around this country. If bystanders will step in and do something right now to stop the bleeding through pressure, through a tourniquet, open an airway, put a bit of a splint on, and transport somebody, and those are the 4 skills that we teach non-medical people in the FADER class. We have now taught some 300 or so people in the county. The response has been overwhelmingly positive. These people say when they finish the course, now I feel empowered to do something about it. I will not stand there and wait 5 minutes for the fire department to arrive, because by that time, the victims may well have bled to death, and so they're starting from a hole. So that's what we're involved in doing. Now, to bring this a little bit more realistically to Marin County, because most Marin County residents, including all of us, are not going to get involved in a major disaster, but we will get involved in an unconscious victim in a mall, or we may get involved in a single car accident, or you may have an accident in your home. So the skills that we're teaching are not only applicable to a major disaster, but are applicable to all of those individual things that you might encounter. The latest thing we're doing to bring our course a little bit more realistic for the county is to add chest compression only CPR and AEDs. I think we're the only group in the county actually trying to teach those things. AEDs, automatic external defibrillators, which are ubiquitous everywhere, but scare the hell out of people. They don't know how to use them. They've never held one in their hands. They're basically foolproof. All you do is get it, open it, it turns on automatically, and it tells you what to do. And once people are convinced that that's all you have to do, they'll start to use it. Chest compression only CPR now, we have evolved from trying to do ventilation because everybody has some residual volume in their lungs. You don't need to do ventilation. You don't need to expose yourself to their infectious disease. All you need to do is chest compressions, and all you need to remember is to do it fast and do it deep. 2 inches, 120. That's all you need to teach anybody. And you really can't hurt anybody there either, except maybe break a rib. And we can treat a broken rib. That's pretty easy. So that's what we're doing. We need your help. What time will it take? As much time as you want to give it. We'd like you to spend maybe an hour or so a year. We'd love to have you spend some time teaching fader classes. It's really kind of a kick because these people have no medical knowledge at all. So we get a real kick out of doing it. We think that by adding AED and chest compression only CPR, we can increase the survival rate that is currently about 20 or 25% if somebody goes down in a mall, especially if you wait 5 minutes until the fire department arrives. We think we can increase that to about 85% because most of the cardiac problems that occur in malls when people become unconscious are not dead hearts. As you all know, they're arrhythmias. VTAC, VFib doesn't make any difference to the people who are treating them. You simply get an AED and you start and you use it right now. And the only way you can hurt somebody with that is if you don't use it. So that's what we're teaching. We'd like you to join us, and please do it if you have some time. Thank you.
But with an MMRC organization, they keep databases and current licenses and who's been to what training and things like that, and knowing if you're a hospital or a clinic or a surgery center, which we hope some people are from today, that if someone is sent to you, it doesn't mean that you now have to take a stranger and pretend you're insuring them. So is that correct, Lisa?
Yes, so we have an agreement with the county. If the MMRC is activated and deployed, then it's covered under our workman's comp. So there's insurance coverage. There's also insurance coverage through the national just disaster response as well.
Excellent presentation, but I had one question. I see that you're filming, and I wonder, is this going to be available to the general public? It could be on the Marin station, it could be on the web, but I really hope that it's made available to the general public to get people more aware of exactly what we're talking about, MMRC, and how it interacts with the county and with the hospital. So I hope that's going to happen. And then for Dr. Rodriguez, you talked about vulnerability. Does that include computer network hacking?
In response to putting us on yes, public television in Marin County, we actually have a member of MMRC, Scott Sochan, who is involved with them and is working on that. We have not quite gotten there. We don't want to put the entire fader class on television. The reason is that it's very, very hands-on. And it takes about 6 or 7 of us to run a class of 20 or 25 people. And you cannot get hands-on exposure to this sort of thing if you watch it on TV. Now, we may come up with some point a refresher course eventually and see if we can work that out. Let me just add one thing about insurance, because I have heard so many times throughout my 45 years that an excuse that physicians use when they're on airplanes and wherever, oh, well, my insurance doesn't allow me to get involved in that sort of thing. That's ridiculous. That is purely an excuse not to get involved, because medical people and everyone else are covered by the Good Samaritan Law in the state of California, which exists in every state of this country and most developed countries. So don't think that you are not covered by your insurance. Your medical insurance may not, but there is insurance for you, and you may get sued, rarely. But the chances of you ever losing a lawsuit are practically zero. So don't hesitate to get involved because of insurance reasons.
Hi, thank you. That was great. I'm Dr. Gail Altschuler, and I know you mentioned the local disasters. So I live in West Marin, where we had a major fire 25 years ago, and flooding is not an uncommon event, we have centers set up in our own disaster preparedness that we do periodically. But although the population may be small on a day-to-day basis, if there's a disaster, an earthquake in particular, on a weekend, there could be 10,000 people who do not live there. And it seems that we should be a little more considered, and connected as far as the resources and response goes. I know, like I said, we can do as much as we can locally, but clearly being cut off for, a period of days is, puts us in the scope very much of the conversation you're having.
Yeah, West Marin is a bit of a significant concern, as is the rest of the county, obviously. You have several fire departments all over West Marin, and all of them do have some sort of response system. I hate to say it, but even to a greater extent than some of our fire departments in this part of the county. Marty Frankel, who used to be our director for West Marin, is getting tired. She's been overworked, so we need another volunteer who will step in and take over West Marin, and we'll certainly help you. But we need somebody who lives in that area, who is very definitely concerned, and maybe you're a good candidate.
So I think I was supposed to address your other question about cybersecurity, and full disclosure, I'm not a doctor, but thank you. I'll play one. We do have a very robust cybersecurity program through our IT department. They actually last year started a cyber sleuth program. It's a recognition program and an education program that educates all of our staff and recognizes our staff for catching phishing scams. So we do get bombarded. I mean, it's in the thousands, tens of thousands of attempts. And so for those of you who don't know, ransomware is a very concerning topic and thing that's happening to hospitals. So we do catch a lot of those attempts, and we have a new virus software and a big push to catch those phishing scams. So that is our IT does a fantastic job doing that. So very robust program. Thank you for asking.
And I just want to speak to West Marin. West Marin, through Coastal Health Alliance, is part of our healthcare preparedness program. Some of the federal dollars that we secure down through our public health emergency preparedness program has been invested in creating a cache that's housed in the West Marin Services Center, which is moving temporarily, but I just was in email conversations last week about resupplying that cache. And again, we're also looking at engaging West Marin through Coastal Health in our FADER training program. We have been able to connect with Marin community clinics around FADER, and we'll be training both their staff and then as well as offering the FADER class in Spanish to the residents of the Canal District. And we'll be looking again in our partnerships with the community health centers to offer FADER. As Ryan had mentioned earlier, now through CMS, through Medicare and Medi-Cal, our community health centers are now required to have emergency plans. So there is a nice win-win there with our FADER program and building the emergency preparedness for the staff who may be on site at the clinic if there is an emergency, and as well as disseminating that throughout the communities that they serve. But I second Tom's request. Like, we definitely would like more healthcare providers who are living out in West Marin to join the Marin Medical Reserve Corps, and we'll see you afterwards, maybe.
Is there a cache at Marconi Center?
Excuse me?
Is there a supply cache at Marconi Center?
It's at the west. The cache is owned by Coastal Health Alliance, but it's in the West Marin Services Center, the county services center. But it's in movement because there's construction that's going to be going on at that center. So we're going to be using the construction time to resupply that cache. But the other conversation that Tom and I was just last week or the week before, we're discussing one of the components of FADER is connecting it to first aid stations. Belvedere and Tiburon have gone beyond a lot of other communities in Marin County on identifying a first aid station, and that will be a conversation that we explore countywide to work with. Again, there's jurisdictional issues. The county is not everything. The first jurisdiction is right now it would be, for example, Marin General Hospital would set up its own incident command. They exist in your unincorporated Marin, so they're part of the county. But for example, other jurisdictions, Nevada, San Rafael, we recognize and respect those jurisdictions, and we work collaboratively with them. West Marin is unique. Marin City as well is also unique because they're part of unincorporated Marin. So it's part of our awareness that it's that we need to heighten. It's part of our vulnerability on the countywide level, and making sure that we are able to respond, especially knowing the tourism that does move through West Marin on any given weekend. So it's well known.
Okay, we have one last question.
My name is Merrill Neese. I'm a medical director of critical care at this hospital, and I have a kind of comment and a question to address to the doctors in the panel, the three of you. As background, in view of the fact that the current Trump administration has proposed to cut FEMA, Coast Guard, other disaster planning committees and monetary sources for the nation, which could affect us all. I wonder whether you know if there's position papers or statements being made by your organizations to address those things to Congress as well as FEMA and so forth.
From a county perspective, we follow the funding very, very closely. Obviously, we have critical funding streams through both the Affordable Care Act, through FEMA, through CDC, and so we follow those cuts very closely, and then work with. We're part of many different agencies that have lobbying efforts at the federal level to advocate for both the states as well as counties and the impacts that any federal shifts that may make in our funding and how it may trickle down. Fortunately, we haven't seen in Health and Human Services yet a threat to our emergency funding, but it's something that we're consistently tracking. You saw it in Congress last year with Zika. There's always these ongoing threats. Like when Zika surged, it surges into our health department. We have been able to pull down funding, but you may have seen in the news how congressional decisions can stymie the release of dollars to the states and then to the local governments. So we're tracking it and we're monitoring it, and I imagine the hospitals as well.
The California Hospital Association also follows it very closely, and they do a lot of advocacy and lobbying. So, and we get a lot of updates and information from the California Hospital Association as well. Something that we're tracking.
Obviously we're into 100 days of this. Maybe I'll call it a fiasco. I guess whatever we are, or whatever we call it. I think it's too early to tell where the cuts are going to come, but there certainly are going to be some, we know. And I think the point is that we probably should stay local then, make our efforts locally, because we can get a voice locally. We may not be able to do it at the federal level, but we certainly can locally. And if you talk to your city managers, you talk to your city councils, you can probably convince them that we need to come up with some money to do some of these things.
It's my pleasure now to present Dr. Jan Horn. He is a physician who has done rubble pile medicine. After what you've heard, you can guess what that would be. Has worked with FEMA, has been with the Zuckerberg Trauma Center for many years, and is an intensivist at the San Francisco VA, and I consider him my gift. He was kind enough to donate his time and talents. A friend of mine, or a previous manager that worked with me, suggested he might be an ideal person. And he was gracious enough to say, sure. So I'll turn the program over to Dr. Horn.
I must tell you that my own personal involvement with casualties, multi-casualty incidents, mass casualty incidents, and disasters began when I started out as a trauma surgeon on the faculty at what used to be called San Francisco General Hospital, or the Mission Hospital. And I was operating one afternoon, and the earthquake in Loma Prieta struck. The lights went out and all the instruments went on the floor. And I looked at the resident and I said, I think this surgery is over, and a nurse came running in with a flashlight, and she said, "You better go to the emergency department." And I went down. Of course, there were no elevators, the stairwell into the ER, and they handed me toe tags and said, "We have a disaster, you're in charge." I had never had any training in disaster responses, and I didn't even know what these toe tags were. They were triage tags, as it were. And that was the beginning of my sort of career in this arena. Over the years, I responded to 101 California, a multi-shooter event, and I was fortunate to save the life of a lawyer from Arkansas who was a victim of that, and a massive gunshot wound. I was on call the night of the San Bruno fire, which was advertised in the emergency department as a plane crash before they really had enough intel to actually determine that it was a gas main explosion. And I volunteered after 9/11 to become a member of the FEMA Urban Search and Rescue Team that's based out of Menlo Park. And I was deployed to Hurricane Katrina and several other events after that, and did a lot of training in search and rescue operations as part of the federal teams that go out. And I know that Tom here has been, part of the disaster medical assistance teams who also went to Katrina, and we have a lot we share in terms of those kinds of experiences. And from all of this, I've kind of come to a lot of conclusions about disaster responses. So what I'd like to do today is to give you a little bit of a focus on what is our overall global risk, and is it something that's static or changing? I think that I'm going to move from there into a discussion, and a little bit deviating from the outline, into a discussion of a local response to a multi-casualty incident or disaster, and what is the hospital, role in this process. And then after the break that we have, I'm going to move into a discussion of the incident command system and how we interface with other agencies throughout the community, the state, and at the federal level. And then finally, I'm going to discuss a little bit about the strategy of triage, and end by giving you some triage scenarios to hopefully test your ability to rapidly make decisions about the victims that are at hand. So with that, what is a mass casualty incident? It's defined as basically an overwhelming situation that consumes the resources of the medical and public health services of an affected community. And these so-called events can be small in nature, or they can be large, and they can be man-made, consequence of our technology, if you will, and they can be natural disasters, consequence in most cases of weather and nasty weather. There's a wide range of casualties and destruction to the infrastructure, and from that, tremendous loss of life, tremendous loss of our communities, and tremendous cost to the society. You have the search and rescue operations to retrieve victims, the initial field triage and stabilization, and then the process of decontamination if it's necessary prior to that in the field, and then evacuation and arrival in the hospital, where a secondary triage process goes on, and definitive medical care. The range of sort of medical problems that we see are related to blunt mechanisms, which can be falls, struck by force objects, forceful crushing, and blast injuries, the blast wind effect of explosions. There can be penetrating mechanisms of impalement, shrapnel, amputations, and gunshot wounds or so forth. And believe it or not, the Knife and Gun Club gets active after disasters, and that's how I actually spent my night after Loma Prieta was taking care of all the looters in San Francisco. There can be burns and thermal chemical scalding of skin. There's toxic, metabolic, and infectious problems, which could be induced or not. They can be a natural consequence of the environment, and it brings about, obviously, the potential for chemical, biologic, radiologic, and nuclear terrorist events. And then there's also the environmental exposures that could affect workers, that could affect people in the field, which have respiratory contaminating substances in the water during floods, and temperature extremes leading to hypothermia, hyperthermia, and situations like that. So this is what you face in the way of problems from people in the community exposed to a disaster. Oops. There are environmental hazards. This was what it looked like in one of the houses I entered in New Orleans after the water receded. That's the refrigerator laying on its side and all the, the material. And this was the kind of environment that we had to work in. This was the 9/11 disaster, and one of the federal workers there walking through that community. This is a disaster that I think created a unique hazard that we've never even thought about, which is basically the dust contained human remains. And people breathed that in and were sensitized antigenetically to other humans and developed respiratory complications as a unique result of that situation, actually. So disasters don't always occur, downtown where it's easy to drive around and so forth. They can be in austere environments. And certainly Marin County has its share of rugged canyons and two-lane highways subject to mudslides and all those kinds of things. You have you board the ocean, and so you have certainly your share of problems in that regard. But then there's also the aspects of how everybody around you responds to things, and there are constraints that it could be political. To give you an example, the response of FEMA to the Katrina flooding and so forth was very politically motivated, and at the time a sort of democratic local government wanted to maintain control. The federal government came in, it was a Republican administration at the time, and very interestingly, there was conflict over who should be in charge. And the federal government sort of took over without utilizing martial law, but in de facto it actually was martial law. And those are sort of the constraints then in terms of how you supply the aid. The other thing, of course, is where does the money come from to respond to these kinds of disasters? And the other issues are, terrorism and weapons of mass destruction and the potential for that, which we also have to be prepared for and create unique problems. So this is a world map with a display of earthquake events over the last recordable history that we've been measuring on the Richter scale, the intensity of earthquakes. And so the little blobs there represent in color the magnitude of the earthquakes as seen on this scale over here. And you'll notice there's a pattern to it, right? And the pattern actually follows the tectonic plates and fault lines throughout our globe. And another interesting thing is that humans have a tremendous propensity to want to live in coastal areas. And so we seem to subject ourselves to the risk of earthquakes. This is wildland fires in, again, the dots throughout here, and certain areas are much more prone because they have the fuel, which is, of course, your forest. And then in the cases of drought, which is displayed in brown, you notice that those forests without natural burns, and because of the fact that we have had the Smokey Bear policy of trying to preserve our forests, we haven't let the forests burn naturally to the degree where there's a lot of fuel piled up in our forests throughout our country. So we're very vulnerable. And then we build homes right on the edge of the forests, up in Lake Tahoe or whatever, and they are very much vulnerable to the damage from that. Cyclones, another wind and rain event, and you'll notice that there's a pattern. These are all the recorded cyclones historically, which we can see evolve in the Atlantic Ocean and in the Pacific Ocean, and seem to be clustered above and below the equator over here, which has a lot to do with the way the Earth turns and a lot to do with the changes in pressure and heating, above and below that equator as we revolve around the sun. And interestingly, again, damage to coastal areas of Asia and North America and even Africa and Australia are very much a common consequence of that. So, in essence, you can look at the world as having risk, and the risk of mortality is calculated and displayed here through colors based upon all of these different kinds of natural disaster events that we've recorded. And I didn't show you the data for volcanoes and tsunamis and other situations that are also included in this, but most of the U.S. is a low-risk area, but look at some parts of Asia and Indochina and so forth, which fall into very high-risk zones, largely because of their infrastructure and the fact that they haven't prepared as well for disasters. So, in essence, then, you can almost develop a map for natural disaster zones, and certainly we in California are on the high end of that, largely because of our earthquake and tsunami risk, in addition to wildfires and flooding. So is there, a static process of disaster risk, or is this something that changes over time? And this is interesting data that comes from the United Nations, and it supports the concept that there's a rising incidence, and this is actually hard to see here in terms of the last 15 or so, 20 years, from 80 to 2011, and basically floods and storms got worse. In addition to which there's been a slight increase in drought, and certainly the scale here is obviously not meant to display a big rise, but just any rise is significant. And so there are those, if you believe in climate change, who feel that we are seeing a potentially increasing risk of natural events that could be disaster prone. And this is, sort of a man-made phenomenon in reality because of our change in the warming of our climate. And certainly, if you look at the money and economic losses over the last, from 50 to 2005, you'll notice that the trend, again, is increasing in all these categories. Now, this is, hard to relate in terms of the dollars and inflation and so forth, but in essence, they seem to be more expensive disasters. And when you look at the global impact, then this is just the 10 years more recently, between 2005 and 14, looking at damage in billions of dollars worldwide. And there's several areas that were really off the curve. For instance, earthquakes and tsunamis in Asia and the Indian Ocean between December and early 2011. The flooding that occurred in 2010, the earthquakes in 14, and tremendous mortality. Look at the number of people, 70% of whom died in the tsunami in that year, and the numbers of people affected. And so this is what's happening worldwide, and we're looking at over 10 years, $1.4 trillion, 1.7 billion affected individuals, and about 700,000 mortalities over that decade from disasters. Okay, so the man-made ones are something we could control potentially, but they also occur, and I'll just briefly summarize this. We kind of categorize them with the concept of CBRNE, which stands for chemical, biological, radiologic, nuclear, and explosive or incendiary. And Homeland Security came out with this nice sort of risk colored chart, but relies upon the concept of RAIN, which is to recognize, avoid, isolate, and notify. This is how you should respond to those kinds of potential disasters, because they have unique characteristics that make the response sort of specialized. So for instance, these unique characteristics or et cetera, will almost be identifiable up front, and so they help to understand when this is occurring, because they can be insidious in nature. And so there's a high profile nature to that in terms of the number of responders, agencies, and resources. They often last for an extended period, perhaps even exhausting resources. Worker fatigue ensues, and backups and replacement teams might be necessary. There's a high probability for disorganization, and they're atypical in terms of having also the added potential for crime scenes, new hazards that we're not used to. And I know that, so if a dirty bomb goes off in the Bay Area, we're going to have a lot of frantic people, even amongst the medical personnel, who may not be familiar with, how to operate in a radiologic or nuclear environment. And there's a big need for personal protection, which is not always used right away. I know that in 9/11, a lot of workers went into that site without respiratory protection until at least the third day. And then, the federal teams came in and mandated that, but the initial responders didn't have that. And of course, there's a lot of damage to infrastructure as a result of these kinds of events. So chemical events, could be a consequence of nerve agents, blister agents, choking agents, and I'm just not going to go over all this, but there's a whole host of them, and recognizing them is really important, because if you bring them into your emergency department without decontamination, suddenly your ER is toast, and you have victims evolving there. The concept of sludgium is used to describe the typical signs of organophosphate poisoning and the need for careful decontamination in the field. Biologic agents are classified by how devastating they are as class 1, 2, or 3, etc. And they are also something that can creep up on you, such as smallpox. Oops, sorry, I'm not getting this thing down. Smallpox and other diseases, plague, anthrax, and we've already seen this, emerging in our society in the last decade or so. Radiation hazards are basically a consequence of the radioactive decay of molecules which produce a combination of electromagnetic radiation, which can be X-rays or gamma rays, very damaging, and also particles that can be also capable of inducing damage. And I think that, the need for shielding, the need for protection and detection with Geiger counters and so forth has to be considered. I don't know if you have a Geiger counter in your emergency department, but it's going to become a standard in the near future. Nuclear, God forbid, is not something anybody would ever look forward to. And this is interesting because what I've got here on this map is, a 10 megaton nuclear explosion located in lower Manhattan. And it shows you the zones of immediate blast injury, and then the expanding areas of flash burns and infrared damage, and then finally the nuclear fallout and the radiation risk immediately. And of course that fallout then, depending on the prevailing winds, will progress outward and so forth. And this lovely map in Google, actually on the web, you have an opportunity to sort of take, various size bombs and put them anywhere you want to see what the hazards are for that community and how big the circle of damage would be in the event. And of course, we're not that far away from, the Northern Korean peninsula, and I can't imagine that he would never think of Silicon Valley as a great target, So, in any event, that's always out there. So, bombings, it's becoming more common. The concept of suicide bombing has emerged. And, I went back and I looked up data that came from both the CDC, the FBI, the State Department. This is bomb-related events in the United States or its embassies and so forth throughout the world from this year, decade period of 88 to 97. Look at this, numbers of embassy bombings and criminal bombings in the US that were investigated by the FBI, the number of bomb deaths. This was the era when we had that explosion at the Olympics in Atlanta, and the number of injuries. So you don't hear about all these things every day in the newspapers and so forth, but this is all happening out there, okay? And the Boston bombing was certainly an event that brought everything into focus. And interestingly, there were only 3 mortalities in that event, and quite a number of people had to sustain amputations of their lower extremities from that bombing. And interestingly, it was not dissimilar, the bomb used to this device here, which is got a kind of a hardware store mixed in with the bomb so that it would inflict shrapnel damage on the individuals. And it has a detonator and etc. The Israelis actually got pretty good at dealing with bus bombings and learned a lot. And we've been able to actually incorporate some of their advice and managements, of those kinds of events into our own response plans in the United States. So Marin County, and this was very nicely outlined already by the panel, is I would say a suburban and rural county, okay? And so you have a mixture of more densely populated and less densely populated areas, and yet you are certainly prone to flooding. You have all this coastline, which could, especially in an earthquake zone, be subject to tsunamis. Rising tides in the bay could be flooding this side, and streams and lakes and rivers within the county leading to mudslides, because there are elevations that could account for that. Earthquakes, we had the big one, and we're ready for another one. Wildland fires, Dr. Cromwell has nicely delineated some of that. Pandemic diseases, whether they are, the flu or whether they are biologic warfare or whatever, certainly a problem that we face. And of course, terrorism. So you can't go to sleep. You can't really ignore these threats. And I'm really pleased to see that people are taking this very seriously, just by virtue of your being here today. From a scene, okay, and then be able to use their system of communication to dispatch the appropriate services. The concept of ethane, which refers to basically the exact location, the type and mechanism and scope of the damage, any hazards, like for instance, if there could be a hazmat situation, how do you get there? What's the best way for the fire trucks to navigate through the traffic, etc.? What are the initial estimates in terms of casualties, dead or injured? And then what services are already on scene so that we don't duplicate or overwhelm things. And so we go from there to the public health disaster paradigm, which is designed again as the all hazards approach. And it has 4 essential phases which you're all engaging in, and it was really nicely outlined by Mr. Rodriguez earlier. And so basically there's a preparedness phase which involves preparation and mitigation, where you're learning and you're doing drills in order to practice the process. And mitigation is the implementation of technology and other kinds of adjuncts in order to enhance your capability in your response. And then, of course, as it occurs, there's a response to the disaster which unfolds over a period of time. And there's a pre-hospital and in-hospital component to that, where field operations occur, and then, of course, delivery and drop off to the hospital for in-hospital care. And there's a unique set of pathophysiology and patterns of injury that the hospital has to adapt to, and then ultimately a recovery phase afterwards. And that's where you get to analyze and understand, the impact and the consequences. The overall goal here is the greatest good for the greatest number, and that stands out as paramount throughout our efforts. So the preparation is in the hospital is to have a straightforward disaster plan, and it sounds like you're in possession of that. You want to keep it simple and operationally something that everybody can master. And you have to train all your hospital staff in the application. And of course, this is where drills come into play. And making them as real as possible is always helpful. And doing it frequently is also helpful, because you kind of forget as time goes on if you're not doing this routinely. This is why, for instance, CPR has to be renewed every 2 years in the state of California to maintain your licensing, just to ensure that you're constantly reiterating that process and don't forget. So it has a certain amount of awareness, and then of course it changes in the pattern and operations of patient care, which I'll get into. So failing to plan is like planning to fail, and you can't get enough of that. Some hospitals have already a little, a card that you carry in your wallet. This is an example from, I don't know where Steiner Memorial Medical Center is, but basically everybody walks around with this constant eponym for cease non-acute patient care activity. In other words, you're not going to do any more elective operations and hip replacements, etc. You're going to devote all the resources to the disaster. You're not going to do chemotherapy, etc. You want to activate the disaster plan and get people to assume their roles depending on who's around and who's available. Individuals should report to their pre-assigned workstations and receive a bulletin or some sort of briefing about what is going on, and then maintain at all times your own personal protection and ensure that everybody is safe and that you do this operation in a manner that is not going to risk the local people. So with that, we also consider mitigation, which is, again, the institution of systems that ensure better outcomes. And I think that the concept of the incident command system comes into play. This is now universal in all multi-casualty incident responses, and I'm going to define that in my next lecture, actually. Drill, 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 as I said before. The hospitals are now, in order to be accredited, mandated to maintain the hospital incident command approach. And in Europe, it has a slightly different name, such as emergency trauma system approach, and that's also used in Australia. So the response is as I said, pre and post and intra-hospital care. Patients need to be decontaminated if there is a potential for bringing something in that's not healthy. Otherwise, you mess up a facility and it becomes inoperational. The disaster triage scheme, and we'll discuss this in more depth, relies upon classifying patients into categories for transport to the hospital based on immediate needs, delayed, or the walking wounded, so to speak, with minor injuries. And then one category you'll never see is the ones that can't make it or are dead. And you have to plan for a surge. Most situations, you can expect a volume increase of about 20% over what you normally see in your hospital. And the actual EMS assignment of and designations actually pay attention to that so that you don't have all of it flooding into one center and not distributed throughout the system. Contamination is basically a rough cleaning, and there's various ways to accomplish this. This is the fireman's approach. You turn on the water and make everybody walk through there. It's not warm though, I can tell you that. And this is how the National Guard does it. You know, they have a roller system like this where they can run people through, and you have to pay attention ultimately to water temperature, runoff, where is that contaminated stuff going, and the patient or victim's privacy, etc., security, their valuables as you strip their clothes off and so forth. All of that has to be packaged for even crime scene purposes, etc. If it's not done in the field and people come to the hospital, then all hospitals can actually set up in the parking lot an emergency decontamination system, and this is the use of these portable sort of areas to undress and then hose people off prior to getting into the emergency department. And I'm sure you have, already the ability to utilize that in your system here. If it's really serious, stuff out there, hazmat, etc., all the EMS agencies have the capacity for, different kinds of protection based upon respiratory and suits that can allow them to go into nuclear or chemical environments or even incendiary flash explosive environments. The disaster, as I mentioned, involves these categories, and we'll go over this more carefully. The concept here is that you would provide care to those who need it the most, as long as the resources can sustain that. And so as you run out of resources, then you sort of switch gears and move on to those less injured, because that's all you can really take care of, okay? The use of tags is now very common, and these come in kits that the services maintain. They have a lot of little fancy gizmos here. For instance, they can be barcoded, so you can follow patients, and there's actually a detachable wrist strap that goes on the patient. There's room to record physiologic data, decontamination information, whether or not antidotes were given in the field or other kinds of treatments, and you can monitor the physical exam, which might change. And so although you might initially start out in a lower category of severity, you may progress over time depending upon how delayed the responses are. Now, I mentioned before the Israeli medical system had to deal with a lot of bus bombings about a decade ago, and we don't hear about them now, but over the course of a lot of those incidents, they learned that having a very experienced trauma surgeon at the door of the hospital to literally examine the patients coming off the ambulance had a lot of benefit for making sure that they were appropriately triaged. This was a person who had a lot of experience in managing all sorts of penetrating and blunt trauma, and could immediately dispatch people to the appropriate stations in the hospital. And it's not uncommon that there's a flood of walk-ins that sort of try to get to care on their own, and they can disorient the actual system that's going on to try to do the triage and so forth. So he was always there to prevent those kinds of occurrences, and he was very comfortable making decisions, knowledgeable, and very experienced. In the hospital itself, then, we talk about the concept of at the door, some sort of triage with then sort of a process of dispatch to secondary triage, which could include immediate resuscitative care or delayed care. And then the immediate care leads to some sort of tertiary process, either to the ward, the ICU, or the operating room. And those with minimal needs get shunted to a different location so they don't crowd things in the critical area. The secondary triage then includes the life-saving procedures, and we kind of limit things to damage control and then wait on the other aspects of care until there's really time and opportunity to accomplish them. So we're not going to go ahead and start major processes. It's more or less the ABCs are attended to in that setting. There's always a unidirectional flow of processing people. It's very important to have information go with the patient. So in other words, all the recording of their vital signs or any data that's obtained stays with the patient on their gurney and is not lost to other areas of the hospital because the caretakers may change over the course of time. And you have to have preparation then for special needs individuals, such as those with psychiatric issues. Those are children and elders. They have different responses, and you need to be prepared for that also. And also the homeless population, because they have social needs that may impact their response. The Israeli hospitals then actually adapted to the concept of having an emergency critical care scene set up in their recovery operating room, PACU, or post-anesthesia recovery area. And it was staffed by anesthesiologists and critical care doctors, and not necessarily by trauma surgeons, because they often would be employed in the operating room then. And so they would assign literally a team to each patient to be responsible and stay with that patient, usually some sort of a physician, nurse, and in combination working together. It's important to have the tracking systems available and have this set up in advance, whether you're going to use electronics or not. Depends on each place's capabilities. The barcodes are nice as long as they work, and as long as you have enough barcode, handy dandies around to manage that. Computer systems depend upon electricity, and when that goes out, sometimes that doesn't work, and there's passwords and all that kind of stuff to get in the way. So make it a system that's simple and tried and true in your drills, and will work for you. Okay. Where are the pitfalls? Well, first of all, communication. This always is a big problem, and there's never enough walkie-talkie radios around. You can plan on the cell service going out. In any major disaster, it gets flooded or else it's destroyed by the disaster itself. And so it may not be operational. And you can bet that within the hospital, you're going to have a system for shortwave radios or ham radios or whatever that would allow you to communicate throughout your system. Otherwise, it gets to be a real problem. And this has to be tested up front. You can't just sort of break out the radios for the first time and hand it to somebody and they look at it and say, well, I don't know how this works. It's like we were in the field and they handed me a GPS handheld device, and I had never worked with it before, It all has to be practiced. I remember they yelled at me because I was out in a boat and, I was resuscitating one of the DEA agents that was overwhelmed in the boat from all his gear and whatnot in the heat. And I went a little off circuit to get him into a helicopter, and they yelled at me because I didn't radio in and keep contact. I wasn't used to that. I wasn't, an operator for like firefighters in the field. And so, Doc, we're going to give you a 101 course on radio management, Anyway, supplies are a problem, okay? And whenever you need something, you think it's always there, but I heard before people talking about a cache that's over on the coast. Well, does anybody know what's in that cache? If you had to get something out of the cache, would you know which box to open to get it out? And if not, then what good is the cache? Okay, so that has to be practiced. You all have to become familiar with the contents so you don't waste your time looking for something that's not even in the cache. Okay? Security, big problem. And there's all kinds of insidious characters running around who want to, be a monkey wrench in the process and have personal gain to get out of it. So the New Orleans Police Department was basically underwater. They had no assets. Their cars, their stations, they were all flooded. And they had to depend on outside agencies to manage security. So what did the police do? They went out and robbed the Cadillac dealer and drove off with all the Cadillacs on the lot because they had nothing else to do. Okay, so security all falls apart. And it's really important to keep all the right people in the right places and all the wrong people in where they belong, okay? When Loma Prieta struck, they got the lights on after 30 minutes at San Francisco General. Then we were the only building in the entire county of San Francisco that was lit. Everything else was dark. And you can imagine the street traffic when there's no red lights or green lights or whatever. They couldn't get an ambulance to the hospital because they couldn't traverse the gridlock that occurred. Okay? Volunteers, we'll talk about that a little more, and it's already been discussed because we're introducing the concept of a medical reserve corps. And how do you interface? And is that all set up? Is there plans for that? And at each end of the process, is everybody on the same page? That's very important if it's ever going to be of any use. Okay? It's not over till it's over. So afterwards, one of the big things is, infectious disease problems that linger in that, disaster environment, or were actually promulgated or encouraged by virtue of the disaster. So an example was the dysentery outbreak in Haiti that occurred following the earthquake and was actually brought in as a non-typical organism for that island from some of the workers in the response, actually. And it posed an enormous problem then to that population, which was already stranded in shelters and et cetera, and had no good water supply. In New Orleans, within 3-4 days, every home that had water up to your armpits also had mold on the walls and could not be inhabited, obviously, even after the water got out of there because of the stuff that had to be scraped off the walls, literally. And of course, that was a hazard for the workers there. So what encourages this? So first of all, the movement of populations, the clustering of people, encouraging staphylococcal MRSA infections and things like that. You put people in shelters, great, but they're all clustered together and spreading their MRSA amongst each other. Maybe the school is a better place than a big auditorium because at least there's separate rooms and not so much clustering. These are all things you have to begin to think about. Sanitation and water supplies, they have to be preserved. In a flood, it's impossible to do that. And so the risk of growing things that are nasty is out there. And I remember we had one of our firefighters fell into that water in New Orleans, which had sewage and all kinds of stuff in there. And, we had to decontaminate him and, go through a whole process to make sure that he didn't acquire some badness. So in any case, there's contamination of water, mosquito cultivation once you have standing water in certain areas, and the mold. And in hurricanes, there's endemic pathogens that emerge, traumatic wounds that have particular problems, and that was a big deal in Haiti, obviously, in terms of all these delayed wound problems that had to be dealt with. Seawater contamination of wounds occurred in the tsunamis. Unique organisms that most emergency rooms don't treat every day. And as I mentioned, GI and MRSA in very displaced and clustered populations. Here's some of the common pathogens displayed here. The fecal oral route of infection, airborne and mosquito or vector-borne, depending upon the area that you're in. But all of these can become problems after the initial earthquake or event, and you still face that in your hospital system at a point when you're really tired from doing the initial response. There's also a psychological component that has been studied extensively now. And we all know that the consequence of of post-traumatic stress disorders, and we have a wider recognition of the higher rates of suicide and depression and so forth in victims who've been experiencing these events. But the early response is something that everybody goes through. And it's a population-based phenomenon which involves early group or compact group preservational instincts, then a more wider population preservational process, and then the emotional internalization and how you deal with it, what your level of resiliency is, will have a lot to do with your ultimate response. And after that, you kind of externalize and get it out of your system, and that's when the blaming and the reanalysis and the suits and and all those things happen before you get to the point of normalization. And so, there's aspects of each of these phases that are almost uniquely seen and universally expressed because of the consequence of this disaster impinging upon yourself as an individual and how you respond emotionally, and ultimately get through the process. I remember, at Loma Prieta, I couldn't call my wife, and I had no idea whether my house was standing. I was in the hospital for 2.5 straight days before I ever emerged to find out whether my family was okay. And that has an emotional toll on you. And I felt very empty and very, very dark because this process had taken over and transformed my life in such a way that I had no control over. It's really a life-changing experience. So there are certain things that we can gain from this in terms of understanding understanding that the population behavior progresses through these stages, and you then have the potential to inform and use disaster preparedness to preempt those stages and maximize their outcome. The hazards are unavoidable. The disasters may be mitigated, however, and their consequences can be prevented, okay? Especially, for instance, in a disaster with children, the counseling that's necessary to engage in. And in essence, if individuals are confronted with a hazard, and if they can act sensibly to preserve their own safety, and that's in the early stage, then the disaster preparedness should include training and information so that they will, when confronted, they can make safe and effective decisions, okay? And not shoot from the hip or be emotionally triggered to make bad decisions, which come from that, sort of reptilian part of our brains. And we would like to think that we're all rational in these responses. So in summary, the preparation for this is colossal. You can never do enough. You can never be done. And you can never stop, drills and preparing and upgrading and so forth. And getting the community to embrace that is really important. And that's what I see the role for the MMRC here, is to really educate your community about your unique vulnerabilities and how everybody can play a role and prepare, okay? Any mass casualty incident, then, in this day and age, will be managed at all levels, whether it's municipal, county, state, federal, world, global, whatever, will be managed by a universal language and structured approach called the Incident Command System, okay? And this was adopted about 2 decades ago, first by the EMS agencies in the country, and then expanded into the military and federal government, and is now the language that we all speak universally and allows us to work together, okay? So it's a standard framework of response, and it takes care of things because it provides all the functionally important components or modules that are necessary to make this response. That's been pretty well thought out in advance. So it's an organizational hierarchy, and it enhances the communication and integration of different agencies and responders so that there's no confusion. And I already alluded to how, communication is one of the biggest challenges in this whole operation. And the agencies that now utilize this have to do, though. You don't even have a choice. And so you have to get used to that. The basic structure is the first person on the scene becomes the incident commander until somebody else with more experience or more stars on their shoulders, so to speak, takes over. Okay? So the initial design then has already a person in charge on scene to begin to cope with the emergency. And that person hopefully has had some training to know, who to call and what to do on scene. Hopefully you will never, ever have to be an incident commander. The incident commander only basically is surrounded by a small group of individuals that play specific roles and report to that incident commander. And so he doesn't want to hear from the guys in the trenches. He only wants to hear from the chiefs of each of those divisions and communicate back and forth. And by limiting the number that report to him, it limits the confusion and the chaos that could ordinarily occur if suddenly he's barraged by everybody's requests or everybody's problems. And so those people are preordained or pre-assigned and come from these different groups and generally are needed during a multi-casualty incident response. The role of the liaison officer is to directly link this person with other agencies that might be responding. The public information deals with the press and keeps them apprised, but also at bay. All right? The safety and security officer deals with making sure that the workers in your response are not going to be exposed to dangers or are not going to be injured by threats. And then directly underneath this incident commander are 4 groups. The logistics group has a chief which oversees equipment, oversees the medical component, oversees the communications and all those aspects of the technology. The planning section comes up with operational plans for the event, routing of vehicles or where to put people, and the accounting for people that go into the field. At all times you want to be knowing who's out there and who's not and where all your people are. The finance section is behind the scenes promoting the resources and the money that's necessary. And without that, you can't even get off the ground. And so this is an important component. And then the operations are the people that are actually doing the job. So in a hospital system, it's a little different than, say, a search and rescue team. Because in search and rescue, you have searchers, you have rescue, you have dog teams, you have sophisticated, infrared equipment and so forth. In the hospital, you have inpatients and arriving patients. And so it's an entirely different operational scheme. So the incident commander is overall responsible for all decision making, what goes on, etc. The operations are the directors of the resources and again follow the concept of greatest good for the greatest number. The planners are your strategists and collectors of information and recording of the process and monitoring of what goes on. Logistics are the ones that provide the resources, and the money comes from finances and in administration. Sometimes that's a back-end process that occurs after the fact. The beauty of all this, now when you get into the hospital level, is that you're never going to go beyond what your capacity has to offer. And that's because your incident command system is going to know the level of your resources. It's going to know the level of how many doctors, nurses, and people or personnel are on board. And it's going to know, what the numbers are coming in the door and what's upstairs and recovering from other previous events and so forth. Okay? So all of these have a lot of benefit. And typically the operations in the hospital then are an important thing which involves medical care directors and a whole group then again of no more than 4 or 5 people in general reporting to that individual, and they report then from there up to the line to the incident commander, and taking care of all the lab studies, the pharmacy, the different units within the hospital. You may be assigned to something you don't do every day, and it's important not to be a loose cannon and try to get off the grid. You have to stay within what you're assigned, okay? And that's sometimes hard to do. So I'll let you dote on this for a second. I'm going to have to push ahead to get to the triage business before we run out of time here. In the federal response, we have the concept of the National Disaster Management System, and FEMA, under the now auspices of the Department of Homeland Security, supplies disaster medical assistance teams and other specialists of the ISTs, which are the incident support teams, the vehicles, all that kind of stuff, and caches of equipment throughout the country. And then there are hospital-based teams also that practice this process and are available. And this national disaster system was actually set up following the Loma Prieta earthquake. And the senior George Bush was the one who recognized that we didn't have a structure within our country to manage disasters. And he went on then to come up with the initial efforts to establish this. The medical response systems at the municipal level was another concept forwarded by the federal government, and they supported this at the municipal levels, creating command systems and equipment and caches and so forth, being prepared for the all hazards approach, especially where you have complex transportation systems and infrastructure. And then the medical systems would be able to take a more sophisticated approach to the concepts of detection, patient tracking, morgue treatments, and things like that. The Medical Reserve Corps was also a federal brainchild, and it was sanctioned and established back in the early 2001 era, right around the time of 9/11. And it was initially thought of as a cadre of volunteers that could help out, and hence you're all here today because of this, okay? With training, with identification, and the key concept here was that the vetting would occur up front so that people's identities, their licenses, their status, their current employment and accreditations would all be known in advance. So therefore you could plug somebody into the system without having to question these issues. There was a survey in New York to look at specifically the reason why they weren't used in the big hurricane that occurred there. And some of the concepts that emerged from this survey of all the different hospitals. Why didn't you get your MMRC, or I guess New York MRC or whatever, to respond and utilize those volunteers? And these are some of the things that were identified. Lack of hospital-specific training, people coming into a place they weren't familiar with, they didn't know the electronic medical records, We didn't know whether they were clinically competent or not, even while we knew they had a license, so to speak. The liability issues, always crops up, and that's a hard one to get over. Lack of defined roles. How do you use these people? Where can you actually be inserted into your system? That has to be planned for, okay? And most cases, it's like non-acute care. It's like you go take care of the patients that are already in the hospital because they're all plugged in, so to speak, and we'll have another group to do the emergency stuff, So the legal issues also cropped up, and the federal government and sovereign immunity for government workers only is available for those that are deployed in the event, but doesn't extend to the volunteer organizations, okay, and not-for-profit entities, okay. Those are protected, but so for instance, when I went to New Orleans, I was federalized, and I could write prescriptions and so forth in that arena, even though I didn't have a license in Louisiana. Okay. There's been no provision established to protect for-profit hospitals from liability to the actions of medical volunteers. So that is a risk for the hospitals. And this would be, an issue for this hospital. The Good Samaritan law, which protects individuals from civil liability, does not apply to volunteers rendering clinical care in a hospital. It's only if you're on the street and you help somebody. So once you come in the hospital, you're under a whole different blanket of liability. And the emergency statutes and mutual aid compacts, which is EMAC in California, it offers some immunity and protection to volunteers only if the individuals are working within the requesting state and during a declared disaster. So there's a lot of sort of legal stipulations here that have to be met before you can be assured as an MRC volunteer that you're not going to be liable, okay? All that needs to be addressed up front. Otherwise, you're dead in the water. So basically, what are the questions to the volunteers? Are you maintaining your disaster qualifications? And how do you put somebody into an ER they've never worked before in? They need orientation, supervision. That takes away from your response. So you have to be ready to get all that done in advance, okay? So, ICS, very important, mandatory. It's a true opportunity for improvement, and planning and training remain vital. Expect marked enhancement in operations if you utilize it, okay? What is the difference between a disaster and a mass casualty incident? Well, basically, when the demand, which can be significant, is placed on a medical resources and personnel of a community, it becomes a mass casualty incident, and it can be within the framework of their capabilities, so they may or may not be overwhelmed locally, but this occurs much more commonly, and you will face this more likely than a disaster. A disaster is defined by the World Health Organization as when normal conditions of existence are disrupted and the level of suffering exceeds the capacity of the hazard-affected community to respond to it. And so that's kind of a global, capture everything definition. But the distinction probably does have a lot to do with resources and numbers of casualties, and there are no numbers where we can define one versus the other, okay? So, just as an example, it's really the resources available to treat multiple victims and not really the numbers of patients, because there's different distribution of resources. So, for instance, a multi-vehicle injury accident in a rural setting with minimal local resources could be a multi-casualty event, whereas in an urban city where they have a subway train derailment, there's multiple agencies responding and large numbers of victims, but they may be able to sustain that event still within the framework of a non-disaster. On the other hand, an 8.0 magnitude earthquake with initial reports of extensive structural collapse and unknown victims, you got a disaster on your hands. So you see how we sort of categorize these things. In each case, there's an attempt to extract and get the best bang for your buck in terms of rescuing people. And that is something that we practice all throughout. Even the military practices that nowadays. And, you know, the military, by the way, used to triage by basically saying, if I can't get you back on the field within 24 hours to shoot, then we're going to let you go. So only the ones that were really potentially salvageable and deployable were taken care of first. That was World War I military triage. We are different now, okay? Any of these things could happen, obviously. Triage is a term that comes from the French word trier, which means sorting. And it was first actually used to describe sorting of vegetables in France, but then moved on to the battlefield and was utilized in the Napoleonic Wars as they would send out a physician to tend to the wounded before the battle was over. That was a new concept. And maybe, you know, actually help people who could be extracted and supported even though there was shooting going on around them, okay? And the strategies can be different depending on the circumstances. So in general, our triage in our communities is all about critical life-threatening problems have priority, and the less injured get secondarily taken care of. As I said, the military used to do it differently, but now they rapidly extract and evacuate and have upfront hospitals and MASH units and so forth, and a very complex system, and they have very tremendous outcomes, actually. In disaster circumstances, the critical life-threatening problems overwhelm the system, and so they get shunted to the rear, and the priority is dictated by the scale of the disaster. When the earthquakes in Nepal or in Haiti and so forth occurred, or the big storm in the Philippines occurred, etc., those really had a lot to do with determining what they could actually accomplish. Then there are technical issues, such as the hazardous materials. A chlorine truck that overturns and spills out the gas, or radiologic exposure from a dirty bomb, or the need for decontamination. These are all issues that may have preempt the process of actual medical triage. And then, of course, terrorism. As you probably know, we've seen shooter events in this country now where tactical teams, SWAT teams, go in and they step on the victims to get to the shooter. And they will not allow medical teams in until the shooter is neutralized. And if they don't know where the shooter is or whatever, there's no medical team going in there. Okay? And so triage can't even begin until you get rid of the threat. And that's obviously a different strategy than you would at a rollover collision. Okay? So again, the stages of triage are pretty simple. The on-scene primary, there's an initial sort of prioritization of the needs of the patients in a mass scale in cases sometimes, and there's very minimal treatment. In fact, the triage scheme that I'm going to outline for you involves almost no rendering of treatment. Okay? Then there's a secondary interim care which could be established at the scene or else in the hospital, where there's reevaluation, monitoring, resuscitation, and disposition to definitive care. And then that goes on if there is opportunity and involves surgery, diagnostic studies, and monitoring, etc. So we can have a low impact event where the resources are adequate and rapid return to normal business, or a high impact event where you exceed the resources, and you have to call in the troops, so to speak. You have to integrate with other agencies to bring in outside services. You may need to use outside hospitals and transport to them because your hospital is damaged or inoperational. Outside agencies may actually come in and preempt you and sort of take over. Feds versus state versus county, etc. And there's obviously with that an increased need for coordination. The categories are pretty much universal. No matter what triage system you utilize, we give these colors, we give these numbers in terms of priority, and this is the walking wounded, the ones that are minor injured. They can actually evacuate from the area, but they should not be allowed to disperse and disappear. They should all be followed in one area where you can collect them. The second priority is a delayed evacuation because they have non-life-threatening injuries and are deemed, capable of waiting for extraction. They may have a fracture that limits their ambulation or whatever. The red is the high priority, life-threatening conditions, and they need immediate evacuation to a treatment center. The black is used to represent those that are dead or expectant. And so in a large casualty event, you may look at people and say, you're not going to make it, buddy. And you may have to sort of put them in that expectant capacity. And when you have enough people then to staff that group, you may provide comfort care to them until they expire. But essentially, they're on the verge of death, and no amount of resuscitation or whatever is probably going to be effective at avoiding death, okay? And those are grouped together. In some systems, the black category is actually represented as blue or white to distinguish from the actual dead, okay? All right, so tags are important. I showed you one before. They have the advantage of alerting other providers to what they will encounter and not make mistakes or have to re-triage the patients, and it's a tracking system. The newer tags that are often utilized now by a lot of agencies involve larger colors in a plastic bag so that is always facing outside and contains the other cards in case they change their status and have to go from a yellow to a red or whatever. That's still available, okay? So this is a nice system. It's very highly visible, especially in the dark and things like that, and has more room for data on the cards. These are some new tags that are coming out now because of our problem with zombies, and they have, of course, the advantage that the providers know when to run. You don't need a morgue in this category in purple here, and they are self-tracking, but in any event, the START system is basically what has been adapted or utilized primarily within our country for the last more than several decades. And so I'm going to actually start off with that and then show you some of the modifications that have come along the way. This was developed by a group of EMS personnel on the fire department in Newport Beach, and then embraced throughout the country, okay? It's easy to use. You focus on your signs and symptoms, and it's fast. It should not take more than 30 seconds per individual to make the assessment and tag them, okay? It's based upon the concept that your initial assessment is, are you able to walk? You ask the question. And if they nod their head and get up, they're the walking wounded. They're green. They get a green tag. You don't forget to not give them the tag, but they're out of your way. And you want to use that as a way to flush out the ones that could be sort of confusing for other people as they arrive. And so get them off to one area that's specified. And then you use the so-called RPMs, which is a physiologic assessment of their respiratory drive, their perfusion, and their mental status. And this has evolved over time so that there are different ways of accomplishing this. But basically, the fate of the wounded lies in the hands of the ones who apply the first dressing. You're the first dressing when you're doing the triage, okay? And step one is you assess, are they breathing or not? And if they are not breathing, you have the capability or the mandate to manually readjust their jaw and try to open the airway. And then if they don't spontaneously breathe, they get a black tag. They're dead. If they breathe on opening the airway, they get a red tag and you move on. Once you establish red, by virtue of that, you're not going to wait around to do more. But if you arrive and they are breathing and it's out of the limits of less than 10 or greater than 30 per minute, they get a red tag. Now, what does this actually mean? So 30 per minute means they're breathing once every 2 seconds. And 10 or less means they're, 6 or 7 seconds between breaths. The normal should be in the range of 5, which is 12 breaths per minute, okay? And up to 30 is allowable. So think of those sort of 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi range for actually measuring your breathing. If the breathing is normal, then you go to the next step. So for the next step, you go to the pulses, and we now rely upon the radial pulse. And the concept is that if you're in shock and you go into somewhat of a vasospasm, you obliterate your radial pulse. And so, in general, if you have a radial pulse, you've probably got a systolic blood pressure above 80. And that's pretty good perfusion. Okay? If you're not able to detect a radial pulse, then you have to be concerned that they're in deep shock. The other alternative is the capillary refill, which is still used in some systems, looking at whether you get a return of perfusion within less than 2 seconds, and if you do, then you go on. If not, you tag them as red. They are in shock. Okay, so there's 2 ways to do this. Some places have gotten rid of the capillary refill because supposing you're, in the dark, you can't see whether they're, refilling or not. There's some places where it might not apply as well, and there's been controversy over whether they all mean the same thing. The military now uses radial pulse in the field to decide where to dispatch their victims of a firefight or whatever. And then the third step is to assess their mental status, and you do a simple command, and you say, squeeze my hand or whatever, or lift your head, etc. And if they follow your command, they get a yellow tag because they got already to this point by not having respiratory or pulse drive issues. They're not in shock, and they're not over-breathing or under-breathing. So now if they can follow a command, they're going to be delayed in terms of their retrieval. If they cannot, they get a red tag and you move on. So you can see how this very simple process allows you to take these steps and go through and get a very quick decision on where these patients are going to go. I'll leave this up for a second because I see someone is trying to take a picture. This is all over the internet. There's a million different versions of this kind of a graph which you can utilize. The morgue is generally at the scene, okay? Get it away from the victims. You don't want to sort of have them exposed to this. It has to be a secure area. Oops, sorry. No onlookers, etc., and accessible to the appropriate people. So, don't forget to tag. And if you don't have tags, then devise a system. Okay, and I'll show you that in a minute. Get rid of the ambulatories, and then focus on the ones that really need the triage. The RPMs is your key to red versus yellow, essentially. And very minimal treatment, just changing the airway, and in this day and age, applying a tourniquet to control rapid hemorrhage from an extremity, okay? With kids, they're a little different, and we take a little bit more leniency, so to speak, with a kid. So we have applied this new concept of Jump Start, which is pretty much a modification of the START triage mechanisms for anybody between the ages of 1 and 8. And the only differences are in respiratory. If you open the airway and they start breathing, great. If they don't, they get a black. But you can, if they're apneic, give them 5 rescue breaths, okay? And sort of encourage them to breathe. And then you can even accept a slightly higher respiratory rate in the process, okay? With the pulse, again, the radial pulse is pretty much the same. The mental status is a little harder to assess, especially in a neonate. So you're going to rely upon the AVPU, which is, is there any alertness, any response to verbal or pressure, or, posturing, and then unresponsive aspects. And so it's a more crude Glasgow coma type of approach. And with little babies, all the victims under 1 year go to green and secondary triage. We don't give up. We don't put them in the morgue, okay? And you follow the Jump Start routine to decide whether they're red or yellow, but there are no more black, green, patients at that age, okay? So the treatments basically are simple, as I said, repositioning the airway, and in some cases in children, rescue breaths, the use of a tourniquet, and it's important to then establish zones, and start to really separate the people so that they get appropriate treatment and pay attention to the need for decon or radiation monitoring, etc. And a lot of responders now use these blankets to start putting the patients into the different areas so the transport people know where to go and which ones to pick up first, okay? How does it break down? Well, if you're the responder and you're doing this, there's a lot of panic and confusion at the scene. There's noise, there's poor visibility. It can be pouring, raining, or whatever. And you may be exposed to a personal threat. The active shooter scene, for instance. You may feel inexperienced. Your objectivity could go out the window because you're emotionally responding to this. This is awful business to do triage and see people so mangled, laying around in a heap. If you don't use the tags, it all goes to hell, all right? Because then somebody has to redo it. Miscommunication. Well, maybe they speak a different language. Maybe they're demented. Children can't communicate. Loss of hearing from a blast injury. Their tympanic membranes are blown out. In which case, they talk to them and they look at you. And then, of course, the victims get in the way. Suddenly, their injuries are more profound than what it really is. My daughter does this all the time. She's always really, really sick. And, I have to sort of say, well, when you vomit, then come back and talk to me. I'm not really going to get excited about your nausea, okay? Malicious interference. They responded to a scene of a bombing in the South, and then they put another bomb in the dumpster so that as all the first responders got there, they had to experience another bomb going off. So, it can be a mess. So finally, the data on this is terrible. We've never really tracked the START system or any other trauma system, except in retrospect. We take a bunch of people and we say, were they appropriately triaged to some level of capacity or injury or whatever, such as an injury severity score at a certain threshold? And you can look back and say, well, 80% went to the wrong category or whatever. And so the only prospective studies were actually a review where they used the training exercise to test people. And then they instituted the START training on top of that and then retested and showed that they improved the outcome of triage with the training process, okay? But in a review of a train accident in Southern California, there were 48% were correctly triaged, 50% over triaged, and 2% under triaged, so they might have fallen through the cracks. I guess it's better to be a little bit overcautious, but this could overwhelm your system. You don't want to be generating a lot of over triage. And in this review of trauma patients, again using 3 different sort of systems of triage, looking at sensitivity, which is the over triage, specificity is under triage, and they basically found that the START system had the best results overall in terms of sensitivity and specificity. With a pediatric retrospective review of patients coming into the emergency department, they achieved values always with a lot of over triage, but pretty low levels of under triage. Why has it not worked? Well, either unwitnessed physiologic deterioration after the initial thing, missing occult injuries is very easy. I saw this a lot. You know, this is why we got into the habit of doing an important survey of the victim after they had their initial resuscitation in the operating room or whatever. We would go back and then find, oh, you got a broken toe or whatever, added to the things which were missed in the initial evaluation. And then over triage often occurs where people kind of lean towards assigning red when they don't need it, or put them in the yellow when they should be in the green, etc. Okay, and that wastes a lot of resources. So, what happened then in about 5 or 6 years ago, the CDC said, you know, everywhere you go in the country, they use a different triage system, and they all have good reason to do it. And why is this happening? And why can't we get a universal system that everybody will use and adhere to? And what is the best system? Well, they established ways to evaluate a triage system. They got a whole bunch of experts in. They convened a big Congress. They put up the money for all this. And they evolved the concept of the SALT methodology, which is really the best and the latest and greatest. And a lot of it was not based on data, but actually on expert opinion. But in any event, it stands for sort, assess, life-saving interventions, treatment, and/or transport. So it's very highly adapted from START, but it applies to all ages and all kinds of systems. And you know, this was their review of the other ones that were being used. So I'll end with the SALT system here, which basically incorporates a sorting event where 2 questions are asked. Can you walk? Get up and walk away. Number 2, if you can't walk, wave your hand. Now you immediately know who are the yellows and the greens, or potential yellows and greens. Okay? And then if there's still obvious, if there's no signs of life, you go to assess those first, because they're not moving. So you want to see if they're going to be red or black, all right? And at that point, you're going to institute life-saving maneuvers, and it includes control of hemorrhage, opening the airway, chest decompression with a needle, if you have it available for a tension pneumothorax, and autoinjectors, which are used for organophosphate poisoning. Includes an anticholinesterase inhibitor, a cholinesterase inhibitor, and a Valium. And those are, the EpiPens. In any event, once you've instituted these maneuvers, if they are necessary, then you go on to assess their breathing. If not, they're dead. If they are, then you go and look and see whether they can obey commands, whether they have a pulse, and they're not in distress respiratorily, so at a rapid rate or whatever, and then whether the bleeding is controlled. And if all of these are yes, they go to the minimal or delayed categories, depending upon minor injuries or not. And if any of these are no, you go on to the expectant or immediate categories. Okay? So it's a little bit sort of more capable of getting an accurate result. And I think it's something that you have to look at and you have to kind of dwell on it a little bit, because it's kind of a little bit of a departure from what a lot of people are used to doing, which is the START technology. So we're going to end this and go on then to a couple of scenarios. And you proceed to the site of the explosion. You see about 40 to 50 people strewn about. Okay? The first person you come to is an adult male with soot covering the body and the clothes. You shake him and he moans, and you ask him if he can get up, and he doesn't seem to hear you, and he points to his ears. He is breathing rapidly at but less than 30 per minute, and at this point you would give him a check of the pulse. And which one are you going to go for? The radial, right? And so according to the START criteria, that's the one that will reflect spasm or shock. Okay, and a blood pressure 80 to 90 if it's present. The adult male with the soot covering his clothes, then you would assign a, if the pulse is present and you ask if he's hurt and he still looks at you quizzically, you would give him what? A yellow tag, right? Okay. So he was able to respond to a command in an alternative way. He likely has a ruptured eardrum, and so he has to be suspicious, though, for a pulmonary blast injury, and make sure that he gets out in time for that. But that's something that creeps up over 12 hours, may not need initial treatment. Number 2 was a victim that is not breathing. You would tag black and rapidly go on. You tag red, hoping that he'll begin to breathe. You're not going to waste time with tagging and proceed to the next patient. Open the airway, tag red, and if he starts to breathe, that's the good answer, right? So answer D. And so a maneuver was administered here, and you got some signs of life, and he's still in dire straits, okay? The next victim is a 50-year-old welder with partial amputation of the right lower extremity at the ankle. He has no radial pulses noted. Respiratory rate is 28 breaths per minute. And I don't know how you calculate that so quickly, but in any event, what tag does he get? Okay, he gets the red tag because he's breathing is good, but the absence of the radial pulse means he's in shock and he needs immediate attention. The next is a 36-year-old pipe fitter with fracture of the humerus. He is in pain, but no other obvious distress or injury. He rates the pain as 8 out of 10 when he's prompted, and you would give him a green tag. No, actually, it should be yellow because he can't walk. So fracture of the humerus is the upper arm, so maybe he can walk, all right, not his leg. And so that's why he potentially is green, okay? And then the next victim is a 42-year-old fabricator with a fracture of the tib fib. So his lower extremity is out. And deformity, he has severe pain. Respiratory rate's a little high. He's got a radial pulse of 120, so and brisk refill, though. So we would probably give him, based on the pulse and respiratory rate, probably lean into the red category. But he probably would survive long enough, so the initial tag is yellow, but need for monitoring of his situation, okay?
Do you put the respiratory rate change? So 34 now it's
Yeah, so you're not going to die with 34.
right, but the next one.
And he's in a lot of pain, so I'm interpreting this as, you know, we're going to not devote all the attention to him because it's an isolated tib fib fracture. As best as we can tell at this point. Okay?
Quick question. So, obviously, when you're in a situation like this, your resources are limited. Do you do you recommend possibly using some of the greens who may be able to help out? And
Yes, absolutely.
certain people to assist?
But they have to be queried in terms of their reliability. But if somebody says, oh, I'm a paramedic, can I give you a hand? Yes, by all means. And then you can assign them. Well, you take all the greens over there and monitor them and watch them. You know what I mean? Or something along those lines. Absolutely. Okay, so we're going to move on to a different exercise. You'll be given, I'll cut it down a little, 30 seconds to respond to 10 scenarios from a multi-casualty incident. And this is where you have an answer sheet. You can jot them down to keep track if you want, okay? So I'm not going to give you the answers right away. You're driving on Sir Francis Drake Boulevard towards Point Reyes, and a tourist bus, which is right in front of you, blocking the way, suddenly careens off the highway to avoid a head-on collision and rolls over at the edge of the shoulder, tumbles down a hill, and then strikes a house and crushes the house. You witness the collapse of the house and victims flying out of the windows of the bus. And it's not the Google bus, okay? You immediately stop and you call 911, and you are told, it's 10 minutes, we'll be there, we're on our way. So you make your way down the hill and you begin to triage people. You don't have tags, you didn't carry them in your glove compartment, but you designate the red with pine cones that are laying around, and the yellow with dry grass, because it's a yellow color, it's in the fall. And the ones who are dead, you just turn over face down. So when they come, you're going to give those designations to the providers, okay? So, victim number 1 has a bone projecting from the right leg, breathing once every 4 seconds, knows name, date, and what happened. Color returns to the fingertips in 2 seconds. Don't shout it out, just mark it down on your paper. Number 2, no visible injury, blank stare, cannot feel any air movement from the chest. The color does not return to the fingertips. Number 3, amputated left arm, hanging by a shred of skin. The bleeding is controllable with a tourniquet, and so you actually found a piece of rope and applied that. Breathing once every 4 seconds, knows name and date and what happened, and the color returns to the fingertips in 4 seconds. So the hemorrhage was controlled by the maneuver. The next one has severe bleeding from a head wound. Breathing once every 2 seconds. Not responsive to any questions. You shake them, no response. The color returns to the fingertips in 4 seconds. This one, number 5, has a back injury. He's unable to move. Breathing once every 4 seconds. He knows his name, date, and what happened. Color returns to the fingertips in 2 seconds. Victim number 6 has a severe head injury. He's not breathing. Not responsive to questions. Color return in 4 seconds. Number 7, this one's trapped under the side of the bus. Both feet are crushed. Breathing once every 3 seconds. Knows his name and date and what happened. Has a brisk capillary refill in 1 second. Victim number 8 has wincing, sharp chest pain with inspiration, possible broken ribs. Breathing is once every second, rapid. Knows his name and date and what happened, has good refill. or capillary refill of 2 seconds. Victim number 9, piece of wood sticking out of his neck, breathing once every second, not alert or responsive. Color returns to the finger in 4 seconds. Victim number 10, visibly pregnant, 5 months, has cuts on her right arm, has good capillary refill, breathing once every 5 seconds. She tells you she's a nurse. All right. So, now we'll go through the answers. Okay? So victim number 1, bone projecting from the right leg, means he can't walk. Breathing every 4 seconds, that's pretty acceptable. He's alert, oriented, answers to commands verbally, and has good capillary refill. So that's a delayed response. Any questions?
So that's the straw.
What?
That's the straw.
Covered with straw.
Face up, covered with straw.
Okay. Number 2, he was dead. Blank stare. Eyes are wide open, and there's no lights on.
Was he the attorney? One can only hope.
No, he's the owner of the house. Number 3, here we controlled the bleeding and hemorrhage, which was the near amputation. But otherwise, the vital signs are acceptable, except for the shock. And this delay or lack of radial pulse that you might find would make that a red pine cone. Severe bleeding from a head wound, breathing every 2 seconds. That's pretty rapid and not responsive to questions, so altered mental status. Color returns in 4 seconds. He has perfusion, but it's delayed. He's in shock. He's got a head injury. It's probably the first one you want to transport out of there. If you can do something with resuscitation, you might subvert, the consequences of the traumatic brain injury. But that's an immediate. It may go south and turn into a black one, an expectant category, if you're lacking in large numbers of ambulances. The person with a back injury, unable to move, he's paralyzed. Okay? He's breathing once every 4 seconds. That's acceptable. He's alert. He's got good color. So basically, he's going to sit and wait for a spine board and all the, immobilization and so forth. This one with a severe head injury has not been breathing, but we didn't check the airway. And once the airway was opened, he begins to breathe. Color returns. He still had some refill, so I gave him a red tag. Okay, this one's controversial. Some people would have put him in the expectant category. Okay? But the fact that he started breathing with a maneuver was a little bit encouraging. Number 7, he's crushed. He's immobile for the time being. In fact, with a crush injury, you want to be very careful how you extract him so you don't reperfuse dead tissue and provoke a massive reperfusion injury. So this is going to require a lot of care with the extraction process. Most likely he gets an IV in the field, he gets treated for hypokalemia and urinary shutdown and all that kind of stuff before you even release the bus from off of him. Okay? The next one, chest pain, broken rib. This one may need a tube. He may have a tension or at least a broken, a simple pneumothorax, and he's tender over the chest, so he probably broke his ribs. But from that standpoint, he becomes more of a potential respiratory collapse, and despite lack of shock, I'd put him in the red category. because he's really salvageable with nothing more than a tube or a needle, okay? This one, you know, he's not going to make it. He's basically got a stake through his airway and barely breathing, not responsive, in deep shock. By the time you're done triaging, he's going to be out, gone. And then finally, the young lady, minor injury, scratched her arm, and she's one of your first helpers on scene, as you allude to, and is going to be able to work for you, okay? So she's going to organize the wounded people. All right, thank you all for joining us today.